Alright. So for part 2 of this video, we're going to be breaking down the characters of the game. And I'm dedicating this to its own video. I probably should have titled it, but the reason why is I want to go to the embark screen and I want to show you a couple of things. So if you notice here at the very bottom of the screen, there are these positions that are listed right here. And the reason why I am mentioning this is because each of these positions on the bottom is very important for building your lineup. Now, first off, let's explain a couple of things. The farmstead that's down here has 3 levels to it. The first level is an apprentice level. Very simple, very easy to complete. Basically, you're just going in there and you're killing a bunch of shit. You'll get a small reward for it and you're good. At level 2, it'll become a veteran level and you'll have to kill the miller. This has you doing a bunch of fights before the miller, and then you kill the miller and you get a reward. This is actually incredibly difficult to do. After that, you'll get the darkest one, or the champion version, which is a level 6. Not even level 5, level 6. And this is just going to have you keep killing waves of enemies, and you can pull out whenever you want. That's the main reason why I say the farmstead is more an endgame activity. You can do it in the beginning, you can do it relatively early, in the beginning of the game, and then after that, you're going to have some issues. Now, one of the things that's important to know, if you notice I only have 1 green thing left, that is because this is the last mission that I have to do that requires low-level characters. What you want to focus on doing is you want to get all of your characters' resolve levels. That's the little bar to the left that has the 3, 4, or 5 of them. You want to work on getting these up to 3 early on. Now, your healers are definitely going to get leveled up very quickly because you're always bringing a healer with you, in my opinion. What that means is you are going to want to get all of your green quests done. Otherwise, you're going to have to wait for a certain town event. Now, if you know, let's see if it spawned one here. I didn't spawn one here. There's fetch quests that will spawn here where you'll get a specific town event. I talked about this in the last video, like Caregiver Convention or Bumper Crop, where they'll give you a specific reward. These right here where they want you to kill something, these are boss quests, where basically the goal is just to go kill a boss. Each of these 4 regions has 2 bosses, and you have to kill them 3 times, 1 on each difficulty. So you'll have one that's apprentice, you'll have one that's veteran, and you'll have one that's champion. And as you level and get higher level classes, you're going to get more and more of these classes. It's important to note, high level resolved characters will not go do littling missions. So like this character right here, who's a 4, he'll go down and do a level 1 mission. This character right here that is a level 5, this character will not go because he's too high level. So you have to manage your expectations. You're too high level, they straight up won't do it outside of 1 quest line. So like I have to do this event right here for the Prophet. I have to do this as soon as I end the stream. That's what I'm going to be doing because all of my Vestal healers are at 5. The only healers I have left are these guys right here, and they're 1 mission away from 5. So I am going to have to do one of these missions. And I have to do it. These missions are actually quite fun. They are very challenging when you're first trying to figure them out. If you go into them and blindly rush into them with level 1 or level 2 resolved characters, you're going to die. Most of the time, what you want to be doing is you want to explore 90% of rooms, and you want to do fetch quests, like Bumper Crop and Caregiver Convention. Especially when you're in the greens. Once you have your characters up to the higher end of 2 or into 3, I would say go ahead and do these bosses, knock them out the way. By the time, well, you want to be in level 3 when you do the veteran stuff, you're really doing the same thing. The battle rooms are kind of annoying because if they're spread out, if there's a battle room that's in a really weird part of the map, you'll have to backtrack a lot. So they kind of feel like longer versions of exploring 90% of rooms. I don't do Crimson Court. Like I said, I'm not really going to update you on Crimson Court. But the other reason why we're here is I said I was explaining the characters. I need to see, so if you see on the roster there on the bottom, there are these 4 slots. These are incredibly important for explaining classes and abilities. And this is where the meat and potatoes of this video is going to be. So, every class in the game falls into a specific numerical role that I need to demonstrate. So, this is a leper, for example. Lepers fall into the 1 role. A leper is going to be in this spot right here. This is the 1. So think of the list as 4, 3, 2, 1. You need to remember this for when I'm explaining in video. 1s are close range melee tanks. They are melee dealers. They are your frontline characters. The 2 is a very flexible position. This can be for off melee characters. This can be for melee characters, not just off melee characters, but for some range characters as well. This is a very flexible class. Most melee characters can play from the 2. Some range characters can play from the 2. Like if you notice I have the Man of Arms, he can play from the 2. He doesn't really need to be in the 1. Another example is the Flagellant can play in the 2. He doesn't need to be there. Mobility classes like the Shield Breaker, they're going to be the 1 or the 2. They spend the majority of their time bouncing between the 2. So it's very important. If I'm running a Shield Breaker, I need to have another character with them that's capable of playing the 1 or the 2. You know, you can't put a Leper with them. The Leper needs to be in the 1. You can't put a Hellion with them. The Hellion needs to be in the 1. Consequently, you might have a class like the Highwayman, where depending on how the Highwayman is built, he can play anywhere from the 1 to the 3. Or he can play the 2 through the 4. But your options are going to be limited depending on your build. So like a Highwayman in particular, he's primarily a 2 and a 3. He can play the 4, he can play the 1. It's not a strong suit. The 3 is the position I primarily will chuck a healer on. Hold on. The 3 is where I will primarily chuck a healer on. Now, your healer generally wants to be in the 3 or the 4, depending on how you have them built and who your backline is. So, for example, this backline character is a designated 4. Because all of their skills are usable while they are in the 4 position. They don't have any skills while they're in the 3. Or, well, any skills that need to be in the 3. But this backline right here has skills that are needed for being in the 3. They have one skill in particular that they can't use if they're in the 4. So that means if I want to run them and a healer, my healer needs to be able to play from the 4. This is just an example as to how you have to build things very specifically. So, let's talk about the classes. Let's talk about positioning. The obvious answer would be to start at the top based off of how I have them ordered, but I don't have them ordered in the way you think. I have them ordered based off of a piece of paper over to the side. So, looking at the Antiquarian and the Jester, do I have one? I don't have one. The Antiquarian and the Jester, I don't like. The Antiquarian is a low healer that's primarily around buffing your team with buffs, nerfing the enemy team with debuffs, and gold find. The Jester is a combo character. They move around a lot, they have to do build up for a finale, which deals a ton of damage, and they're also a stress healer. Many people love running the Jester for stress heal. I don't. I'm not a fan of the Jester. I think both of those classes are too complicated for simple Ooga brain. Ooga. I like my combat skills more. So, let us talk about the characters that are definitively in the 1. The first one is the Leper. The Leper is the easiest character to explain what they do. The reason why the Leper is in the 1 is because they have a lot of trinkets that buff. So when you're looking at trinkets, you want to look at trinkets that are giving you different varying abilities. So for example, most classes are going to have most classes are going to have 2 builds to them for the most part. And if they don't have 2 builds, like my 2 lepers here are running the exact same combat skills. They have different levels to them, obviously, but they're running the same 4 combat skills. The reason for this is because how I differentiate them as trinkets. Trinkets are what you're going to do to change how a character is built. Quirks are relatively random. You don't have a lot of control over quirks, so sometimes you kind of have to deal with what you're dealt. So, for example, this leper right here is based around speed. I'm running plus speed on them. And the reason why I'm doing this is I like the faster leper. Whereas this leper right here is more tanky and damage oriented. They're based around, this is bonus accuracy, this is bonus crit, this is bonus damage, little less virtue, which kind of sucks. That has to do with your stress mechanic. If you want to explain the stats real quick while we're here, basically match XP is match XP. Basically, this is how much health you have before you die, or before you hit your death blow limit. Dodge is your chance to dodge a hit. Higher dodge chances are particularly good, and there are builds you can do that can reduce this greatly, where you can get tons of dodge in certain circumstances. Dodge, however, is not as important as speed is. If you ever have to choose between minus to a stat, I would generally choose minus to dodge over minus to speed. I prefer something like minus to a resist instead. Like if you notice how on this trinket right here, this has, this one. This one has minus 20% move resist. I'm fine with that. This is normally a character that has 100% move resist, so going down to 80%, I'm fine with that. If this is a different class where maybe it only has 50% move resist, that might be more difficult. So damage is just your base damage numbers. This is based around your weapon, and this is what all of your skills will base themselves around. So if you notice, the only thing that your skills are going to have is an accuracy and a crit modifier. So your base crit modifier and accuracy modifier here adds on top of what your skill has. And part of the reason why this is important is debuffs, okay? So as an example, I have no bonus accuracy on this right here, and I have a 90% accuracy base on my character, and all characters have a 5% base chance to hit no matter what. This means I have 95 accuracy on this move. However, enemies have an inherent dodge value. Their dodge value gets subtracted for that. So let's say it's a faster, squishier enemy. They've got 10 dodge. Your base accuracy goes from 95 to 85%. If they have a buff that gives them extra dodge, now let's say you go from 85 to 75. If they put a debuff on you that makes you less accurate, then that gets applied as well. However, if you look, I'm going to use this one as an example, okay? I have plus 13 accuracy mod on this character. What that means is my chop by default has a base value, the 90% to chop, plus 5 chance to hit no matter what, plus 13. You would assume that this hits all the time. No, it doesn't. All enemies have a 5% chance to dodge no matter what. You always have a 5% chance to hit, and they always have a 5% chance to dodge no matter what. Now, this makes this character much more accurate in certain scenarios, but it's important to play that into perspective. Protection is the amount of damage that you can reduce from damage that you would take. Some classes build into this heavy, some classes don't. I'm not as big of a fan. I prefer the dodge than the protection. It can be nice if you build into it. It's not something I'm going to go out of my way and get. Speed is very important, but it's also not important at the same time. The way speed works, because this is basically a Dungeons and Dragons simulator, is that you're going to roll, everybody's going to roll speed. They're going to roll a number between 1 and 6, and then your speed is going to be added on top of that. That's how turn order is determined. Enemies also have a starting speed number. It works the same way. Everybody gets a value rolls a die basically between 1 and 6, and that's added to your speed. That's why you can have the fastest character in the game. You can have a base speed of 14 and still go second. Another thing that's important is boss type enemies are not allowed to get back-to-back consecutive turns. But if they get multiple actions in a turn, because they can't do them back-to-back, they will get multiple opportunities. So they might go first on a turn because they have a high speed roll. Your highest character will go second, then they will go again with their second action, then your second highest character will go, etc. This means that a character with a high speed, such as this character having 5 speed, I could go very high in the order if I roll, say, a 5. Now, you won't see what the roll is, by the way. You won't see it, but that's more to know. Let's say I get a 5 roll, and so I have a speed of 10. I might go first or second on my team, depending on how it's built. Whereas, ordinarily, I'm going to be the last one on my team to go if I'm rolling a 1 or a 2. Just because even 5 speed is relatively low. Some classes have inherently faster speeds. Like, if you notice, the Grave Robbers are inherently faster. The Man of Arms are intentionally slower. Highwaymen are relatively faster. Bounty Hunters are relatively faster. Shield Breakers and Flagelants are relatively faster. So, now that we've covered some of the basic stats, let's cover each of the classes. Leper is primarily a 1. Part of this is because of the trinkets that they get access to. That gives them position if bonus damage if they're in the 1 position. Covering their skills. Unfortunately, the Leper really only has 4 skills that are any valuable. So you have Ooga Booga Swing, which most melee classes have an Ooga Booga Swing. Every class has a basic attack, so to speak, that they're going to have. This is this class's Ooga Booga Swing. That's pretty much all you need to know. We're going to call it Ooga Booga Swing because I like saying that. Ooga Booga. Ooga. Ooga Booga Swing is going to be a standard that's run on most classes in this game. So if you look, the Crusader gets access to Smite. The Sacrificial Stab, you kind of don't need to run on the Occultist. I have one that does. I have one that doesn't, as you'll see. But this can be helpful. This is a class that can differentiate. They don't need the Ooga Booga Swing, so to speak. Abomination's a rare exception where they have all of their abilities active all the time. You don't pick or choose, but I'll explain that afterwards. This is another class that they're very flexible. They don't have to have that. You're going to have an Ooga Booga Swing here. You're going to have an Ooga Booga Swing on the Hellion, which is Wicked Hack. This is a flexible class as well. You don't have to have Pick to the Face. I do recommend it, and I'll explain why when I get to that character specifically. Ranged characters also function a similar way. This character has a ranged shot. That's their primary role. They're a ranged, they kill opposing team backline. This class as well, they have an Ooga Booga Swing, but they're a backline character, so their swing isn't as important. Their backline role, they have standard attack. They have an Ooga Booga Swing. They're a close range character. They have an Ooga Booga Swing, but because they're primarily backline, they're more flexible. They have multiple Ooga Booga Swings, but they're very flexible based off of your build. They have an Ooga Booga Swing because they're a melee class. They use their melee weapon for damage. They're a long-range class, so they have a long-range Ooga Booga Swing. They have an Ooga Booga Swing as well, but they're kind of a unique class because of how their movement works. And then because they're a primarily close-range class, they have an Ooga Booga Swing. That's the reason why I wanted to explain that. Almost every class is going to have an Ooga Booga Swing, except some of the more flexible, build-friendly ones. However, a lot of classes, the Leper included, fall into the niche up. They're going to run the same 2 or the same 3 skills on every build. The Leper is one of the rare exceptions. All Lepers are going to run the same 4, and we're going to explain why. So you have Chop. This is high accuracy, high crit. It's your Ice Swing for damage skill. You have Hue. This deals 50% less damage than your weapon does. So this is going to do 50% less than Chop does. However, this will hit the first 2 targets. This hits the 1 and the 2. So this is more useful for clearing corpses. This is more useful for hitting low health targets for getting a double KO. And this is useful in scenarios where you want to do more if you're trying to do like group damage. So for example, if you have a highwayman behind you that's using Grape Shot Blast, and then you're using Hue so that the 2 of you can knock out 2 enemies together. If you're trying to do a multi-damage approach on early turns, Hue is very good for that. To me, I like running it for corpse clearing. The problem that the Leper has, why the Leper needs to be a 1, almost all of their skills are only usable from the 1 position. These 2 skills right here are the only skills they can use that are not usable from the 1 or the 2 position. And that is very important to understand. If your team gets shuffled, whether you get surprised, or you get ambushed, or an enemy moves you around, classes don't always need to be able to hit every position. So a Leper does not need to run this ability right here, which can hit the 3 and the 4. You don't need to run it. It's not very good. But what you do need to do is have an action. So, for example, if I get knocked into the back line, I can pop Revenge that turn. And then I will have to move forward. Some characters have skills that enable them to attack from other positions and move forward. And that can be helpful parts of their kit. But if, for example, let's say I'm in the 3, right? I can pop this ability if I wanted to. Next turn move up, and then the turn after I attack. Which can help tank turns. The reason why I have this skill right here, this is a heal. It's not a great heal. Unless you level it like I have. Like 9 HP is not bad for a heal. The stress heal on it can be very helpful. But this is basically an option you can give yourself if you want to pass turn. So if you have an enemy that's affected with Blight or Bleed, you can and it's like, they're going to die on the next turn. Why, instead of attacking them and ending the fight, if you know they're going to die to the Blight or the Bleed, you can heal yourself, you can buff yourself, you can stress relief yourself, and these are helpful turns for helping your next combat engagement, rather than relying on camping or something else. So, that's the main reason why these skills are run. Revenge is kind of unique, and I'm going to explain the buffs in a sec. This skill is terrible, it does no damage. What it does is it basically can hit any opponent, it removes their stealth, it reduces their damage and their speed by a decent amount. It also buffs your speed, and it marks the target. Okay. And it marks you, basically, so they will focus you. The advantage is that you buff your speed and you remove their stealth. Nerfing their speed and nerfing their damage can be nice. Here's the problem. This class is a big swing build. Your base damage is right around 20. And with a crit, you're in the 40 to 50 range most of the time. You realistically don't want to be wasting your time de-stealthing and doing buffs and debuffs. The main thing that you have going for you is Revenge. Revenge is one of those situations that you want to use in a longer fight. If you think the fight's going to be shorter, say 2 turns, 3 turns, don't bother. Just swing. What Revenge does, you can only use it once. It reduces your dodge, and it increases the damage you take. However, It gives you a significant accuracy boost, a significant crit boost, and a significant damage boost. So your strategy either needs to be your first turn in battle you're wasting on revenge, and then you just swing from there, or you don't use revenge that battle and you just swing away for the most part. That's your main decision you have to make. The downside to revenge is really the damage taken. You take a lot more damage. If you're going up against enemies that hit hard, so for example, the giants in Wield that use Tree Branch Swing, Tree Branch Smackdown, which deals 30 damage base, and now you're taking an additional 8 to 9, that can be almost a full health bar of damage. So the downside to this is it's very high risk, high reward. The other skill that you have that's similar is Withstand. This gives you some damage reduction, and it gives you a lot of debuffs. Here's the problem with this skill. It works hand in hand with Revenge. If you set up Withstand first and then Revenge, the protection can remove the damage reduction, the damage taken. The problem is you're wasting 2 turns, you're marked, and you're hitting. So you're not doing anything for 2 turns just to set yourself up. Really, you want to choose one or the other. If you want to make a tanky build, you can do this. I don't recommend it. And then the other one is Purge. This is very weak. What it does is it hits the enemy that's directly in front of you. It knocks them back 3 spaces, which doesn't matter because it clears corpses. So if they're the only enemy, basically you use this to clear the corpses. And if it's not the only enemy, you're kicking them to the back of the line. And it gives you a little bit of accuracy. If you're looking for an accuracy buff, you use Revenge. If you're looking for corpse clearing, you can kind of just use Hue for that, in my opinion. The other class that wants to be in the 1 position, dedicated to the 1 position, is the Hellion. The Hellion is here. They can play from the 2, don't get me wrong, but there's one reason that's incredibly valuable, and that is Iron Swan. Iron Swan only works when they are in the 1, and it hits the enemy's 4. Melee classes have a very hard time hitting the 4 reliably for damage while they are in the 1. Crusader can hit the 4, but they need to be in the 2 or the 3. Flagellant can hit them, but it's a gimmick. Shield Breaker doesn't count. They are mobility. They are zigzag everywhere. But the ability to hit the 4 is a very valuable position, and it makes the Hellion very strong. The Hellion's in a similar boat to the Leper, in that they kind of play the same skills. You'll see why in a minute, though. So you're gonna have Ooga Booga Swing. It's high accuracy. It deals low damage, but it benefits from critting a lot. You're gonna want to crit a lot with it. Iron Swan, accurate. It hits the 4. It crits a lot. It can take out a lot of low-level 4 players with just 1 hit, or a crit for medium health characters. Here's the other skill that you're going to run is Adrenaline Rush, and every Hellion wants to run this. And the reason why, the heal itself isn't that valuable. You're not running it for the 3 HP heal, although it can be nice. It can cure Blight, it can cure Bleed, that's nice. You're running it for the damage and accuracy buff. Similarly to the Leper, you have to decide at the start of battle if you want to buff yourself up first, or just ignore it. Most of the time it's better to just swing. Like, if I'm going up against a full team of 4, I'll always go Iron Swan first. And then if somebody else moves first and kills the 4, generally I'll just be, wicked hacking away for the most part, unless I need to use another skill. But Adrenaline Rush is something you need to run for a particular instance, and that's what we're going to cover that makes Hellion interesting. The majority of their skills, that being Bleed Out, Breakthrough, and Barbaric Yarp, all debuff you when you use them. They debuff your speed, they debuff your damage. Adrenaline Rush buffs your damage. So if you debuff yourself with either of these skills, you can pop Adrenaline Rush the next turn and get your buffs back at a little bit more. This is very important if you have to use those skills, because these are not insignificant damage buffs. So generally you're going to run these 3 skills, plus you're going to run one of the other skills. Now, I don't run the bleed skills. I think there's other classes that do bleeding better. If it bleeds isn't very good, it deals some decent damage, and it deals bleed over time, but other classes have better bleed. Highwayman, Plague Doctor, and Flagellant have better bleeding. Bleed Out deals a bit more bleed. It deals significant damage. It has base crit. It's very good, but problem, it only hits the 1. It only works when you're in the 1, and it nerfs your damage and speed. It nerfs your damage by 20% and your speed by 3. This basically means you're going to move last every round after that, because your Adrenaline Rush does not buff your speed, by the way. So that's why you want to avoid anything that's really reducing your speed unless you absolutely need its benefit. And the minus 20% damage is relatively significant as well. You're talking about losing 2 to 3 damage per swing now. So that leaves the other 2 skills. So Breakthrough, this lets you hit multiple targets. It's usable from back row positions, and it moves you forward 1 space. The reason why you run this is if you get shuffled, you can move up from the back while still dealing damage. You don't waste the turn by just walking forward. It deals less damage, 50% less damage, so it's not very good for damage, but the debuff is also less. You're only losing 1 speed, you're only losing 10% damage. So realistically, you're trading a point or 2 of damage in the long run for the ability to move forward and hit multiple targets. The other one is Barbaric Yarp. This is a stun that stuns the 1 and the 2 enemy position. Now, the drawback is 20% minus 20% damage and minus 3 speed, which is not good. However, this can be a very good application if you have players on your team that are faster already. So if your strategy is, if you know you're moving at the end of the round anyways, and you want to stun other people so that your teammates that are faster than you can take advantage of that stun at the start of the next round. Especially if they're higher damage or if they have bonuses against stunned enemies. It can be quite valuable. So this is a niche application. And again, you're really only going to be differentiating between, 3 skills plus a 1 of, and then your trinkets for the difference. But because of Iron Swan and Bleed Out, if you choose to run it, I really think that this character benefits from being only played in the 1 position. So, next up we have the classes that specifically can play from either the 1 or the 2. So, the Crusader can play pretty much any position. So we're not going to cover them yet. They can play 1, 2, 3, in my opinion. I'm not going to call them a 4, but they can play 1, 2, 3, 4. The Abomination plays primarily the 2. In my opinion, you want them in the 2. You can put them in the 1. You can put them in the 3. I don't recommend. Put them in the 2. Plague Doctor, I'm not recommending for the 2. You can. There's a niche build on the Grave Robber that I'll cover, where the Grave Robber can play as a frontline character, but they're kind of a niche application. Yes, the Houndmaster can play from the 1. I don't recommend it. The Men of Arms can play from the 1 or the 2. They can play from the 3 technically, but they can play from the 1 or 2. The Highwayman has a build that lets them play from the 1. They can play from the 1 or the 2, so we'll cover them a little later. The Bounty Hunter plays the 1 or the 2. The Shield Breaker plays the 1 or the 2. And the Flagellant plays the 1 or the 2. So we're going to be covering the characters that specifically are playing the 1 or the 2 here. The character that to me that's most likely to play the 1 would be the Man of Arms. The Man of Arms is a tank class. Slow, high health, high protection. Their gimmick is based around defending their team with buffs, debuffs, riposte, and protection. So, Ooga Booga swing, big swing. Not very high damage. Doesn't have any real effects to it. It's not high damage, but if you get a crit, it's a nice bonus. You're going to be somewhere in the 10 to 15 range most of the time. The skill that everyone is going to run in addition to this is Retribution. This activates Riposte. The skill itself does very little damage. You're going to primarily do somewhere in the 1 to 5 range when you hit this skill. Although it does have a little bit of a bonus crit chance on it. What it does is it activates a counter mode for 2 or 3 turns. While you are in this counter mode, anytime an enemy would attempt to attack you, you counterattack them. The counterattack deals 25% less damage, has a 3% crit chance. So it's little less damage. You're usually averaging somewhere in the 6 to 10 range in terms of damage. However, what makes this skill important is it can activate multiple times per turn. So, multiple times, you will have a situation where somebody attacks you, counterattack. Somebody attacks you, counterattack. Somebody attacks you, counterattack. Now, you're still going to take the damage from the attack if you don't dodge it. However, the ability to deal damage multiple times is very important. The remaining skills are kind of up to you. I want to cover Rampart first because Rampart is your only other real damaging move. It deals less damage than your normal swing does, and it has a decent crit modifier on it. However, what it does is it's usable from the 3 position to move you into the 2. Obviously, you can use it from the 2 to go to the 1 as well. It's a movement skill where you can go forward if you get shuffled, because you can't do much from the 3. One thing I do want to mention is that Crush and Riposte both hit the opposing team's 3. That is very important. Most melee skills can only hit the 2. Like, we covered the Hellion and we covered the Leper. Their Ooga Booga swings only hit the 2. The 1 or the 2. The fact that both of these skills can hit the 3 does give him a little utility. That's why he deals a little less damage, because he can hit further up. What Rampart does, it can't hit the 3, it can hit the 1 or the 2, is it knocks back the enemy 1 space, and it can stun them. Now, the knockback is not that great. It's helpful because you're knocking the 1 to the 2 or the 2 to the 3, where you can still hit them. But the stun is the main benefit. It moves you forward and it stuns. So it can be helpful in that regard if you need the stun or if you need to move forward. But the rest of his kit makes this not as mandatory. So let's talk about the rest of his kit. He has 1 debuff, 1 unique state, and 2 shouts that buff your allies. So think of him like a barbarian, so to speak, from Diablo, where he's using his shouts to buff his team up. Bellow is your debuff skill. This hits the entire enemy team. It deals no damage. You'll deal maybe 1 point of damage. What it does is they have a bonus crit chance while you are marked, and it reduces their dodge and their speed. Now, the dodge is pretty much worthless. Even though it's a significant nerf to their dodge, it means that more evasive characters like Doomsayers that dodge a lot, their dodge gets brought down to manageable levels. The main reason you run this is the speed. If you pop this at the start on your first turn, you're basically guaranteeing your team moves first on the next turn. So this can be helpful. Basically, you're sacrificing your turn to make sure that their turn goes last next time. This is very helpful if the enemy is surprised. If you get the surprise factor, it can be helpful to bellow first, because you'll basically get 2 turns of surprise instead of 1. However, the downside is you're not setting up riposte. The value of riposte is you set it up early if you think the fight is going to go longer than 2 rounds, in my opinion. Because the bonus damage dealing opportunity is significant. The only way you're not getting that damage opportunity is if they're either stress damaging you or you're stunned. And if you're stunned, you're losing your turn anyways. Because of that, Retribution and Rebello are really the 1-2 that you're fighting over, that you have to figure out what you're going to set up on your first turn. He's a very setup-oriented character. I don't think Bello is mandatory on every Men of Arms. That's why I only have 1 with Bello. Then the next one that we have is the counter state. This is Defender. What Defender does is it guards an ally. So anytime they would be attacked, they direct the attack to you instead, and you get a buff to damage reduction. You get 26% damage reduction. Now, the downside to this skill is you're wasting a turn not doing anything. If you have Riposte already set up, it's helpful. It only lasts 1 turn, mind you. So it can help if somebody's on death blow, or if they're being targeted a lot, like if they're marked. It can be helpful for protecting them. The downside to it is that sometimes the directing attacks to you can get you killed. There is a shout that goes along with it, which is buff target. What this does is if that target gets an accuracy and crit boost no matter what, if you are guarding them, like if they're slower than you for whatever reason and haven't lost the guard, they get 15% damage. That is very hard to set up. That's why I don't run it. Mainly it's just 5 accuracy and 4 crit base. Those numbers go up as you scale it, and it can be nice for crit chance. It can be very good if you're buffing a class like a Hellion or a Leper that's gonna be dealing tons of damage off a crit, but it's not great in my opinion. I think there's better classes for buffing than that. The other skill that you have is Bolster. Bolster can only be used once in battle. It gives your entire team 8 dodge, and it reduces incoming stress by 15%. Now, that can be good against specific bosses that do a lot of stress damage. The main value is the buff to dodge. And this is another candidate for an early use. That's why I have one with Bolster and Retribution, and I have one that has Bellow and Retribution. You have 2 options at the start of a match that you have to decide how you're gonna go. Do you need, if it's a longer battle, you have to decide what you're gonna go with. Are you gonna go with Retribution and get bonus damage, or are you gonna go with your other skill to buff your team? Both of them are really buffing your team. Now, the downside to Bolster is you only get to use it once. So you're gonna be using it relatively early, and that's kind of it. So your first 2 turns are going to basically be Bolster, Retribution, and then you can start swinging, which is not the greatest. If you're the other build where you have to decide, okay, am I going to go Bellow and Retribution, or am I going to go Retribution and just start swinging? The Man of Arms, though, is very flexible. Because they can hit the 3 position, they get a little bit more utility than some other melee classes. And because they can use some of their skills, like they can use Bellow from any position, they can use Defender from any position, they can use Retribution from the 3, they can use Rampart from the 3, they have a lot of value even at the 3. They can't use their big swing from the 3, which means there can be low damage a lot of times, but Man of Arms is pretty good in that role. The next class that I'm going to talk about that is primarily a 1-2 is going to be the Flagellant. The Flagellant is a very unique class. They are a 1-2 build character. The only skills that they can use are their buffing skills. Their buffing and healing skills. They can use these from any position, but all of their damage dealing skills are specifically used from the 1 or the 2, and that's why I have them there. They're not really a squishy class, but they're not really a tanky class. They're somewhere in the middle. They are a low damage class. They don't deal a lot of damage base. And the reason for this is they are the bleed class. This is one of the premium classes in the game for bleeding and damage, and they're very good at it. If you are going to the Weld, which resists blight and is vulnerable to weak, they are very strong. So they're a healing melee class, and if you notice, every one of these guys is running the same 3 skills. So let's cover the basics. So the first skill that you have, I'm going to go to Vladimir for this. The first skill that we have is Punish. This is your Ooga Booga skill, basically. What this does, it doesn't do a lot of damage. It has a decent crit modifier on it. The main reason why you run this is it is your highest damage swinging skill, and it applies 5 points of bleed damage per turn, and it also debuffs the target, giving them 30% bleed resist. So any of your future hits on them will further bleed them. So if you hit them the first time, if they don't bleed, the second time they're pretty much guaranteed to bleed at that point. So the lack of damage is made up for in the damage over time. Now, 5 points of bleed damage per turn isn't great when you get into the later game, but the bleed resist is valuable. Reign of Sorrow is your only ability that can hit the back row, the 3 and 4 of the enemy. So because of that, Reign of Sorrow kind of gets run. It does very little damage. You're looking at mostly you're going to be dealing 2 or 3 points of damage. However, what it does is it provides bleed on those targets. It's not as good bleed. It's 4 points of bleed instead of 5. But it does hit 2 characters. It does hit back row. And it does provide the same debuff. These are your bread and butter skills. If the only enemies are up the front, you run Punish. If the only enemies are in the back, you run Reign of Sorrows. And you just kill them with the bleed damage, basically. Next up, this is where we get into the gimmicks. So this class actively wants to bleed themselves and get low health in order to get value out of their skills. Exsanguinate can be used 3 times per battle. And it's only usable while you are below 40% HP. For this case, you primarily want to focus on buffing the Flagellant up to having higher HP than normal, so they can activate these skills from a higher category. What Exsanguinate does is it applies an absurd 8 points of bleed damage per round onto the target, in addition to dealing full damage. It will also heal you for a large chunk of your health. However, this reduces any healing received and any healing you would deal for the rest of the battle, and it reduces your speed by 3. So this skill is a very good get out of jail free damage card, but the majority of the time it's good for the burst heal. Like if you're low health, this and the rest of your team is relatively high health, you can use this to heal yourself and inflict some good bleed damage and good damage overall. The downside is the speed reduction is not good, and the fact that all of your healing skills now are less. You receive less healing, including from your own healing skills. And remember that this effect does stack on yourself. So not only are you healing, your base healing is going to drop. The healing you would do to yourself if you use Exsanguinate again is going to go down. So this is basically, if you use Exsanguinate a second time, instead of healing 46% max HP, the next time you activate it, you're going to heal about 33%. And then the next time you activate it, you're going to heal about 20% of your HP. So it's not very good in the long run for that reason. The other skill, one skill I don't want to talk about that's not very good is Suffer. What Suffer does is it transfers Blight, Bleed, and Marking from any of your other allies and applies it to you. You take their Blight, Bleed, and Mark. You also take 20% less stress damage, and you get a Death Blow resist. This is good if you're intentionally trying to get yourself weaker, because you can take the Bleed or Blight from another character and put it on yourself. However, I don't prefer to do that. This is a squishier class than you think. When you start playing this class, you're going to see it's quite squishy, because it doesn't have the lethality that other classes do. You also have Endure. This basically lets you target another ally and take 10 stress off of them, put 10 stress on yourself, and it gives yourself a speed boost. So the idea for Endure is that you synergize Endure with Exsanguinate or Redeem, so that you can use Endure to gradually get your speed back. The problem that this class has is that this skill is just not worth it. The stress healing from one isn't valuable to the other. Now, your other two primary skills are really where I differentiate. I have one class that has the 2 heals and one class that has just the burst heal. The burst heal is Redeem, is actually quite good. It only activates when you are below 40% HP. You only get to use it twice per turn, or twice per battle. And it heals you for 46% max HP. It heals an ally for 40% max HP. So it is a very good burst heal on an ally and yourself. And the penalties are less impactful, because what it means is if you were to use your second usage, you're healing yourself for about 32% max HP, and you're healing your ally for 30% HP. So you essentially are getting 2 burst heals per fight, although you are losing a significant amount of speed if you use both of these. This class is normally a fast class in combat, but struggles in longer term fights where they have to use their skills more reliably. The burst heal on this is just very valuable to keep in your back pocket. You never know when you're going to need it, and that's the reason why you have the damage build where you run the double below 40%, and why I have the heal build where you get the second heal. The second heal is relatively interesting. What it does is it heals an ally for 3 points of health per turn for 3 turns. But it bleeds you for 4 points of damage for 3 rounds. Now, you can cleanse that with a bandage. So, if you plan on running this a lot, you can, if you want to make him a primary healer, you can run a lot of bandages on him and make him more of a frontline healer. However, the downside that you really have with this is the fact that you're running a consumable to remove one of your buffs. You're going to take that initial 4 points of damage. Also, 3 points of healing per round is not very good. Because if you need a burst heal, you yourself have to get low enough in order to use Exsanguinate. So it's a very fun class to play, but it lacks overall lethality unless enemies are weak to bleed, or you're willing to take a ton of damage. The next class that I'm going to put as a 1-2 is the Bounty Hunter. Now, the Bounty Hunter primarily works best as a 2 than a 1. They don't have a high HP stat where they can take a lot of hits from a 1 perspective. However, They have good dodge, good speed, good crit. They build around being elusive and being a setup class. There's actually a lot of variety that you can build in the Bounty Hunter. I have 2 builds for Bounty Hunter, but realistically, you could have 3 or 4. So, let's cover Bounty Hunter. Bounty Hunter has 2 skills that every Bounty Hunter is going to run. So that is your Ooga Booga Big Swing, which is collect bounty. What's nice about this is that you can use this ability when you are in the 3. And what's nice about Finish Him is that you can use this while you're in the 3, and this will also hit enemies that are in the 3. That's the main reason why I run both of these skills on any build, is just for the extra attacking range that they have. So technically you could play him from the 3 if you wanted, if you're running a very melee heavy build. The downside is your class would specifically need somebody that can hit the 4. So you're either going to need a Hellion with Iron Swan, or you're going to need a Shield Breaker for the most part. Now you have movement skills and stun skills that are very valuable to you. But before I cover those, let's cover some of the gimmicks. Finish Him deals 50% bonus damage against stunned enemies. This means that on average, you're going to be dealing about 12 to 15 damage. Well, 12 to 18 damage, I should say, to a stunned target. They need to be stunned for this to work. So generally, you're going to either need to set up the stun yourself, which you have 2 options for doing that, or you're going to need to have somebody else on your team that runs a stun as well. That's why I have somebody that's built into the stun to get value out of this, and I have somebody that's not built into the stun. I'm really only running this Finish Him skill so that I can hit the 3 position. That's the only reason the skill is being run on this particular Bounty Hunter right here. Your standard collect bounty deals 90% bonus damage against marked, so obviously you're going to want to pair this with a character that can do marking, or against or if you mark the character yourself. This is a significant bonus of damage. This is very good against bosses as well, because what you can do is you can set up your mark and then swing on them the next turn for absurd damage. The downside is that it's relatively slow. Remember, it needs 2 turns to pull this off. The other thing you have is the bonus damage versus human enemy. This is very good damage, believe it or not, and this can be a designated killer for humanoid enemies, whereas the Crusader is good against Unholy, and the Occultist is good against Eldritch. This is good for human enemies. So, the fact that these bonus damages are in play does give the Bounty Hunter very good utility. And because everything they have is high crit chance, if you score a crit, you're pretty much one-shotting whatever you have. This is why this character in particular is built around being a class that does high crit and high damage. Now, let's talk about the mark while we're here, because I mentioned it. The mark does no damage. What it does do is it gives you a significant speed boost of +4. It marks the target, applying the mark to them, and it also applies a debuff that removes 18% damage reduction. This is good against tankier enemies that have, some of the tankier enemies in the game that have 70 to 80% protection on them. It can take a little bit of that off. The main reason you're running Mark for Death is to set up Collect Bounty against very tanky targets, like bosses or certain enemies. The other reason you want to run it is there are other classes that can take advantage of marked damage that you can benefit from quite significantly. That being said, this is pretty much a wasted ability. You're basically, similarly to the Man of Arms, you're kind of wasting that opening turn to apply the buff. You're applying the speed buff, you're applying the mark on them. So that leaves your remaining 4 moves, which are going to be a combination of stuns and mobility tools. So, for caltropes, I'm not a fan of. Now, I like the idea of the caltropes in theory, but the other skills that the Bounty Hunter has are just too good. It's low damage. It deals like 1 damage. It applies 2 bleed for 3 rounds. And what it does is it debuffs the target so they take more damage and they move slower. This can be helpful for setup. The problem with it is it only applies to the back row enemies. And the bleed isn't strong enough. And you're better off just marking them, which you can do with either Come Hither or Mark for Death. Come Hither is just better for dealing with back row threats than Caltrops is. Yes, they take more damage. Yes, they get a big drop in speed. But the problem is they're still in the back row. And there's better skills for bleeding back row, like Reign of Sorrow, as example, that we already covered on Flagerist. And there's better tools at your disposal for debuffing speed, like Bellow on Man of Arms. The main reason you run it is for the damage taken. And I'm not particularly fond of that. That's why I don't run it. So the other 3 skills that you have are all movement skills. First off, for this bounty hunter, we have Come Hither. What this does is this deals significantly less damage. You're really going to be dealing somewhere in the 1 to 4 range in terms of damage. But it yeets a character that is in the 4 or the 3 position, and it pulls them forward to the front of the group. It also marks them. So if you have a very difficult target to hit in the back row, let's say a 4, you can run Come Hither, which will automatically pull them to the front for you and mark them for Collect Bounty. This is very effective against targets that are in the 3-4, whereas Mark for Death is better if they're in the 1-2. But it can deal decent damage if you score a crit. It can actually deal into the 6 or 7 range on damage if you crit. But it's nice if, like, there's a target in the back that's like 1 HP, like literally 1 HP, and you're up. You can throw Come Hither just to try and finish them off. But I don't necessarily recommend it. The other 2 movement skills are both stun-based, and I call them movement skills for a reason. Uppercut can only be used when you're in the 1 or the 2. This is one of the reasons why I call him as a 1-2 character. It deals low damage. You're really going to be dealing somewhere in the 2 to 5 range most of the time. It has a little crit chance on it. Nah, don't worry about that. What it does do, though, is it stuns them and it knocks them back 2. Now, knocking them back 2 is good. If you hit the 1, it knocks them to the 3. If you hit the 2, it knocks them to the 4. If you're hitting the 2, it's not good. But if you're hitting the 1, it's fine because it knocks them to the 3, where you can use Finish Him the next turn to knock him out. It's just nice for a stun. Flashbang is the stun that you use for back row. It deals no damage, but it's a guaranteed stun just about, and it shuffles that target to a random spot in their own lineup. Sometimes this hurts you if they get shuffled back to the 4. If, let's say, it's a 2 or a 3, and you shuffle them back to the 4. But generally what it's good for doing is it's good for stunning a back row target like a 3 or a 4 and trying to move them forward. So it has utility on that. The randomness of it, though, can be kind of limiting. Overall, this is a class that does very well building around high crit chance and setting up. They need a turn to set up, whether they're setting up a stun for Finish Him or whether they're setting up a mark for Collect Bounty. They do very high damage with that turn to set up. Very similar to a leper, where lepers have raw damage and the setup just makes them more accurate and give them a little more damage, but they trade off by taking more damage. This class is faster and crits more, but they need the crit to get big damage. The next class that I want to cover is going to be the Shield Bearer. The Shield Bearer is the Shield Breaker is a very interesting class. Now, they have a couple of unique tools at their disposal that I just don't run. They really have 4 dominant skills that you run all the time. The Shield Breaker is a very pay-to-win type class, if you think about it. Of all the DLC classes, the 3 of them, this is really the one that you could buy this class and kind of just sort of sweep through a lot of fights with. And I'll explain why in a sec. So the 2 builds that I have going, by the way, is one that's more melee focused and one that's more blight focused, because they have a lot of skills that apply blight. So let's talk about what this class does. This class is a high mobility class. They are constantly bouncing between the 1 and the 2 with how their skills work. Now, a lot of their skills can move them up to the 1, and to be honest, they are very reliable just spamming Pierce in your face. What this class does is it is armor piercing, meaning it ignores enemy protection. That is very good for dealing with tanky targets. It can be used at the 1, 2, or the 3 spot, and it can hit all 4 enemy positions. This is very valuable as a melee class because they are the designated sniper of your team, so to speak. This class is very good if you want to run a melee heavy lineup, where this class in particular just spams the 4, while whoever you have in the 2 and the 3 as melee classes can deal with the frontline characters. The downside is that they have lower HP for being a frontline character. They're fast, they have dodge, and they have a couple of tricks up their sleeve for helping them avoid damage, but at the end of the day, they do have low HP. If they get hit hard a lot of the time. This skill is very good. High crit, it deals a little less damage than your base weapon, but it hits 1 through 4. Very good. It also moves you forward 1 spot every time you use it, so you can use it from a back row position to move forward no matter what. Next, you have Puncture. Puncture bypasses guarding. This is very interesting. It can be used from any position. It does half your damage that you would normally deal. It reduces their speed by 1. And it pulls them forward 2 positions if they're not already in the front. What this is useful is certain enemies that apply protection buffs where they act like a man of arms, protect a teammate. This completely ignores that bypass and breaks it. However, I really don't think that that is useful enough to run. The problem that I really have with it is just that it's only really useful in that one scenario. Because you don't really care about pulling the target forward or reducing their speed. There are other classes like the Bounty Hunter that do this better. So the main reason why you would run this is just for the guard break. And it's just simply not a common enough status effect or an annoying enough status effect where you really have to deal with that. I'll talk about those next. The other skill that moves you forward is going to be Serpent Sway. This is the other skill that I run. A lot of people swear by this, but I'm going to explain why it's not the end-all be-all. Serpent Sway can be used twice per battle. It buffs your speed by 3. It moves you forward 1 position. And what it does is it gives you armor. This allows you to block 2 hits. Any 2 hits of damage. It does not prevent status effect damage or stress damage. This means Blight and Bleed will still apply, and you will still take Blight and Bleed damage. However, if you on Death's Door, this is a very good skill. And because each cast of Serpent Sway blocks 2 attacks, this oftentimes means if you get attacked once or twice per turn, you're essentially just delaying your own death while your team is getting the opportunity to heal you. There are some add-ons that do work kind of nice with this, but the main reason you're running this is the first time you use it, if you know it's going to be a longer fight, you can buff your speed relatively early in the fight, tank a little bit of damage. This gives you some unique tank power that you wouldn't otherwise normally have as a Sway user. Next up is the skill Captivate. This is one of the only skill that does not move you back, and that's why we're going to cover it here. We did the forward movers. Now we're going to cover the neutral. Captivate can only be used while you're in the 2 or the 3. It can only hit the opposing teams 2 or 3, and it does not hit them both. That is the main reason why I don't run this skill. Not very good in my opinion. It deals low damage. It's 25% less damage than you would normally run. That's not the main reason. It applies 3 points of blight for 3 rounds, and it deals bonus damage. The blight, I should say, deals bonus damage against marked enemies. The skill itself does not deal bonus damage against marked enemies. There's not really a lot of gimmicks for this class around marking like there is with other classes, so that benefit is kind of out the window. The problem that I really have with this skill is that this is a class that relies around a lot on movement or just spamming pierce to pierce the back row. That's kind of what they do. This is kind of an afterthought. If you want blight, there are better blight skills in their kit, and if you want to hit the 2 or the 3, you can just pierce them to death for more damage. So that's the main reason I don't run this. Now we will cover the skills that move you back. Expose is a very interesting skill. You could run Expose. This skill moves you back 1 space. Now, if you are in the 3 when you use this and it moves you back to the 4, that can be problematic because there's not a lot you can do from the 4, believe it or not. You have Puncture that you can use, and you have Puncture that you can use. So because of that, it kind of limits your options if you're there. But if you're using it at the 1 or the 2, it's fine. What it does, it deals less damage than normal. It removes stealth from whoever you hit. It increases their chance of being crit, and it drops their speed. This is good for de-stealthing enemies. However, I simply think the other parts of their kit are better. The other 2 skills that would move you back are simply better in my opinion. However, this as a niche application for de-stealthing is very good. Like, I would consider it on this class right here, if I'm being honest. Maybe instead of Adder's Kiss, I run Expose, just to get the extra utility out. But it's a very hard bargain to choose between Expose and Adder's Kiss. The reason why is Adder's Kiss is really good. Adder's Kiss can only be used while you're in the 1, which definitely limits its usefulness. This is why I say you bounce a lot between 1 and 2. It moves you back 1 space. It can only hit the opposing team's 1 or 2. But it deals full damage, high crit chance, 4 points of blight for 3 rounds. The blight isn't the main reason you run this. This is a very high damage dealing skill. And it has a high crit chance, and it applies blight. So on average, an average hit is going to be somewhere in the 10 to 15 range. A crit is somewhere in the 15 to 20 range. And you're getting blight on them, so you're guaranteed 4 points of damage next turn. So, this is a useful skill if you need to move back against single targets. If you need to move back against group targets, we have Impale. Impale applies lower damage. You're really going to be doing somewhere in the 3 to 6 range in terms of damage. But it hits all 4 enemies on the enemy team. And it does put a point of blight on per round. The blight damage is insignificant. The main reason you run this is the most useful thing. If you need to move back 1 spot, if you want to juggle, like if you start a fight at the 1, you can use Impale at the start to hit all the enemies for some damage, move back 1 spot, then use Puncture to finish somebody off next turn, Impale back if there's still 3 or 4 targets left, so that you can move back. You can alternate very quickly between Pierce and Impale, or Pierce, Adders, for single target damage. So, this class is a very high damage, high crit chance, similar to the Bounty Hunter, but they are much more fragile than even the Bounty Hunter is, and they rely a lot more on some gimmicks. If they get stunned, they're pretty much a sitting duck. and it can be very difficult to determine when you want to activate Serpent Sway. You only get 2 uses per battle, so if you know it's a longer fight and you activate it at the start of the fight, you can lose some early damage that the enemy might be using to set up. If you use it too early, you're only going to have 1 use for later in a game when you're on death's door. So it might be a little bit difficult to balance that out. The next class that we're going to cover that can fit in the 1-2 position is going to be the Abomination. This is the last class in the game that I specifically put in the 1 or the 2. Like, I always put the Abomination in the 2. They are my designated 2. They are a very unique class in that they have all of their combat skills are available to them. They don't have to choose. You need to level up all of these. What makes them unique is that there's 3 skills that are available to them in human form. They have a skill that allows them to transform, and then they get access to 3 skills in their Abomination form. So let's explain the mechanic. You can transform twice per battle. The way it works, by the way, is you can transform once to turn into Abomination, and you can transform a second time to turn into a human. If you use the second transform to go back to human, you cannot turn back to Abomination. So, if you use this skill, you need to know you are going to be in Abomination form for the rest of the mode. If the opposing team, like a Siren for example, brings you to their side and pops Abomination, congratulations, you're stuck in human for the rest of the game. Remember that. Or the rest of the battle, I should say. So, what does Transform do besides switch mode? There's a couple of things. When you transform to Beast mode, you get a damage bonus, you get a speed bonus, you get a heal, and you get Blight Resist. Great! So it's a power-up mode. It also gives all of your other allies 8 stress every time you transform. Now, when you are in Abomination form, you take stress damage per turn. It's not a lot of stress damage per turn, but it can add up in longer fights. When you change back to human form, you only lose 1 speed, so you'll keep a +3 speed bonus. If you transform to a beast and transform back, you'll keep +3 speed, because you lose 1. And all of the other allies on your team will lose a little bit of the stress that they took. This means equipment-wise, you're gonna run at least a piece of equipment. You're gonna want the restraining padlock if you can get it. This reduces the stress that you take per turn and the stress inflicted on the party. This keeps it manageable, especially in the early resolve levels when allies take more stress damage. So let's discuss why they are a 2-3 character. In human form, the majority of your skills are going to be used in the 2 or the 3 specifically. The only skills you can use while you're in the 1 or the 4 is either Absolution, which reduces your stress level and it gives you a small heal, or Transform. So, if you're in the 1 or the 4, you kind of have no choice but to transform. Or you can just stall out with healing and stress. Which, believe it or not, is actually not a bad strategy. Especially if you're highly stressed out, you can just keep spamming Absolution for stress relief. But, what do you do for the 2 and the 3? So, these are actually pretty decent damage skills. They're not high damage, but they're good for statusing. So, normally what I will do is I will start a fight in human form. You can stay in human form for a decent amount of time. Beast Bile hits the opposing team's 2-3 and applies Blight over time. It's not a lot of damage. You're dealing like 2 to 4 damage, but then you're also dealing the Blight damage per turn. It's also giving you Blight resist against the target, so you can keep blighting them, which is helpful. It's good for getting some early group damage. And you have Manacles. This is a lower damage skill as well. You're going to deal somewhere in the 4 to 8 range in terms of damage. But what it does is it stuns them. This can hit the 1, 2, or 3. If you are stuck in human form, you're pretty much only going to be spamming this for raw damage output if you need to. If you're stuck in human for whatever reason. The stun's nice. It can be good. Like, if you need to stun a specific enemy, you can stun them at the start with this instead of the Beast Bile. But generally, I will lead one of these two and then transform. Now, remember, when you transform, you get a significant damage bonus, the speed boost, and the blight resist. What do you do in beast form? Well, in beast form, this is why you are a designated 1-2 character as opposed to a 2 or a 3 character. You get access. You can only attack from the 1 or the 2. You can use slam from the 3, and you use that to move up to the 4. What it does is it moves you forward, and it knocks back whoever you hit by 2 spaces, and it debuffs their speed and their dodge. That can be helpful even if you're in the 1 or the 2. If you're in the 1 or the 2, that can actually be helpful just for knocking faster targets down to speed. Especially because the damage debuff isn't that bad. It's only dealing 25% less damage, so it's relatively higher damage. It's not maximum damage, obviously, but Rage is kind of your main damage skill. It's single target damage, high crit chance, and it can hit the 3 position, which most of your beast mode skills can't do. It's the only beast skill you have that can hit the 3. It's just single target damage. And then you have Rake. Rake does half your normal damage, but it buffs your next Rake that you do by 20%. So, using 2 Rakes basically buffs your damage back to where it would. The main value of this is for hitting the 1 and the 2 at the same time. You can go Rake, you can go Rake, you can go Rake, and you can just keep hitting those 1-2 targets for consecutive damage. The burst damage that Rage deals is a bit stronger, but if you need to hit both targets in front of you for damage, whether for corpse clearing, whether for hitting both targets, this is pretty good. Once you get your hands on a restraining padlock, the transformation back and forth doesn't really matter on your team, or if you get your team to a high enough resolve, it doesn't really matter on the stress back and forth. Abomination's kind of unique in that they have access to all of their skills, they use all of their skills, it really just comes down to knowing how to use them. This is why I like to position them specifically in the 2. They're very good in the 2. Class. So, the next classes that we're going to talk about are classes that can play actively the 1, 2, 3 type position. The first class to cover is the Crusader. The Crusader is interesting because they're very much a support class. They can play a tanky frontline role. I have this Crusader built for tanky. If you look, I have extra HP. I have primarily melee skills. You could also build them to be more of a backline class that can play the 2 and the 3 and can attack from the 2 and the 3. They also have good support utility skills that they can use from pretty much any position. So the Crusader is kind of the jack of all trade, master of none. So let's cover the basic skills. There are 2 basic skills that most Crusaders are going to be running in every build. That would be Smite. Smite is just your basic big swing. It gets a 30% damage bonus against unholy enemies. That bonus can be nice, but it's not, like, necessary. And Stunning Blow. Stunning Blow deals 50% less damage, but it is a guaranteed stun. Always helpful. These 2 skills can only be used while you are in the 1-2, and they can only be used against the opposing team 1-2. This makes them more of a frontline character, and the rest of the skills that you're going to run is what diversifies you. So if you're a melee-focused tank that wants to be in the 1 or the 2, you're going to run Zealous Accusation alongside this. This is a ranged skill. That's good for ranged modifiers. This hits the opposing team's 1 and 2 at the same time, so it deals less damage as a result. But this can be helpful for clearing corpses, or it can be helpful for just applying group damage. I find it to be a little more inaccurate than the baseline suggests on it, by the way. If you are building as a ranged tank, then you are going to run Holy Lance. Holy Lance can only be used in the 4 or the 3 position. It does full damage, high crit chance, and bonus 30% damage against Unholy, but it moves you forward 1 spot. So if you're in the 4, it moves you to the 3. If you are in the 3, it moves you to the 2. That is why I have Tank and Frank. These guys are my Crusader twins that both run Unholy Lance. I run them on the same team. I put them in the 2 and the 3 positions. And their whole gimmick is that if the one that's in the 2 goes first, they can use Smite or Stun. If the one is in the 3 goes first, they can use Holy Lance and they move up to the 2. Then the other one uses Holy Lance and moves back up to the 2. Because Holy Lance is very high damage. The downside that Holy Lance has is that it cannot hit the 1. That is the biggest downside to this skill. You cannot hit the 1. You can hit the 2, 3, or 4. You cannot hit the 1 whatsoever. Now, for supporting utility pieces, they actually have a decent amount. The skill that I don't like running is... I don't like Bulwark of Faith. It marks you. It gives you 20% damage reduction. It gives a very significant amount to the torch. You can kind of use this if you're out of torches, and you can use this to pop up the torch a decent amount. It's basically a full torch. The main reason you would run this is for the protection modifier, and I don't think the Crusader really benefits. The Crusader is actually a relatively squishy class without some modifiers. They tend to be on the slower side, which makes them squishy, even though they have a little bit higher HP. Like, my boy Frank here doesn't really have high HP. He's at the 47. That's pretty high. But because of how slow Crusaders are, they're generally in the 1 to 3 range speed-wise without quirks or add-ons. They take a lot more hits. So it makes them squishier by default. So the protection modifier is great for tanking hits, but because it also marks you, it's not very good. The other skill that they have is Battle Heal. Now, Battle Heal and Inspiring Cry are why this class can play pretty much any position. If you're in the 1 or the 2, you have Stun, Zealous, Smite. If you're in the back row, you have Holy Lance to move forward, but you also have access to the other 2 skills. Battle Heal heals 1 target for a decent amount. You're usually healing 3 to 6 health. It's not a lot of healing, but the fact of the matter is, it's a frontline character that can do healing. You can heal from any position. Most healers in the game cannot heal from any position. They have a specific spot where they can heal from, which is mostly back row. He's one of the only characters alongside the Flagellant that can heal from a frontline position. That's very important. I can't stress that enough. Because if you get shuffled around, the fact that he can heal from anywhere means if you have to have a dedicated healer waste a turn moving back to their proper position, he doesn't have that problem. He can do the healing for you. This is why it's always important that your characters have an action that they can do from an out-of-position place. The other option that they have access to is Inspiring Cry. This does very little healing, but it's better because it buffs Stress and Torch. Gives a little bit to the Torch, not the main thing. The main thing is it's also a stress healer. So it can be very valuable for stress healing in combat. If you have somebody that's about to hit their resolve threshold, you can pop this for them and kind of get them to back off. And again, this can also be used from the 1 or the 2. It can also be used to buff the Torch. So these skills can both be what I call turn stallers, where, okay, I'll just heal or stress heal while they die the next turn from Blight or Bleed, rather than just swinging and hitting them. Overall, the Crusader's a very flexible class, but you need to have a skill for both the front and the back line, so you're not wasting a turn moving around. And also, because they deal a lot of unholy damage, they're better in certain maps than in others. The next class that I'm going to cover is the Grave Robber. The Grave Robber has two specific, very diverse builds. One is a melee class that's bouncing between the 1 and the 3, and one is a damage dealing class, a ranged damage dealing class that's playing from the 3 or the 4. And the two builds play very differently, so it's important to cover them in two spots. That's why this class and the other class I'm going to talk about are how I'm going to transition more to the backline damage dealers next. So, this build is the ranged build. This build is the melee build. The melee build is running 3 pieces, and you're going to bring 1 for range. And the range build is running 3 pieces, and you're going to bring 1 for melee. The skill that you're not going to be covering is Toxin Trickery. This is a weird skill. It cures your blight or bleed, and it buffs you. It gives you dodge and speed. Here's the problem. It's pretty much completely outmatched by Shadow Fade for dodge, and the curing blight and bleed is not helpful unless if it also healed you. Even if it was like a 1 or a 2 heal, I'd be fine with that. You get 1 use per battle of it. There's no reason to run this. I would rather have a ranged option than Toxin Trickery. It doesn't see use for me. So, let's cover our options. So, for the melee build, you have 3 melee options, which are very important to manage. First off, we have Pick to the Face. It doesn't deal a lot of damage because your pickaxe doesn't deal a lot of damage. However, the main thing that's important to note is that it hits the opposing team's 1-2, and it is usable from the 3 position. So this is why you can play them in the 3-4. On the ranged character build, this is necessary to use if you are thrown into the 1. It's also useful if you're in the 3, because you can just smack somebody in the face if they're in the 1. The problem with the majority of the range skills is that they can't hit the 1. Except for poison darts, but, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. So if you need to hit the 1 position, pickaxe to the face is good for that. That's also armor piercing. That does help make up for the reduction in damage off of it. Other than that, it's not very good other than just Ooga Booga Snack. Lunge and Shadow Fade are the primary combo that you're going to do. Lunge moves you forward 2 spots, and it's only usable in the 3 or the 4. So the ideal way you would play this is that she plays in the 3, you lunge forward to the 1, and you either big swing, or you can either big swing, or you can Shadow Fade back. So you can constantly alternate between lunge, fade, lunge, fade. Lunge has a very high crit chance. It does bonus damage. It does bonus damage to blighted enemies. This is your primary kill skill for dealing damage. The downside is it's only usable from the 3. So this build requires you to go from the 3 to the 1, or from the 4 to the 2. So you have to play around that. I prefer keeping this as a 1 to 3 because of how the mobility works on it. High damage, very good skill. The other skill that you're pairing with it is Shadow Fade. Shadow Fade moves you back 2 positions. It gives you stealth for 2 rounds, so you can't be targeted. It gives you 95% damage, 7% crit, and 13 dodge. Basically, this fucker doubles your damage output. Now, the reason why I like playing this class as a 1-3 character is because if you Shadow Fade back from the 1 to the 3, you still get access to Pick to the Face. So you can use Pick to the Face, or you can use Lunge. Now, the problem that this class has is they have no real way to hit the 3 or the 4. You can use Lunge to hit the 3, but you can't hit the 4. You have to run a skill that hits the 4, whether that's Poison Dart or Thrown Dagger. And you can't reliably hit from the 1 or the 2. If you're in the 1 or the 2, you only have Pickaxe to the Face. meaning you have to waste the turn moving back with Shadow Fade, or you have to use Poison Dart if you're in the 2. If you're in the 1, your only option is either Fade or Pick. That's why I have Poison Dart here, by the way. Poison Dart is your most reliable tool for hitting the 4. You can use it from the 2. It's the most useful, which is why I have it. Now, we'll cover the range build. The range build functions completely differently. It's more about long-term damage rather than the burst crit damage potential that requires a turn to set up. So you have Pickaxe to the face if you're in the 1 position, because there's not a lot you can do in the 1. This class excels at dealing steady damage. Most fights open with flashing daggers. This hits the 2 and the 3 at the same time. It deals a little less damage. You're going to average about 6 damage a hit. That's what I roughly average, is about 6 damage a hit. It doesn't have a high crit chance on it. It gives them a debuff where they have bleed resist, which doesn't matter. You have no way in your kit to apply bleed. So that's not really the issue. However, it hits the 2 and the 3 for group damage. Then you have Thrown Dagger and Poison Darts. Now these can only be used in the 2 through 4 positions. You can't use them in the 1. But Thrown Dagger hits the 2, 3, 4. It's the only option besides Poison Dart that hits the 4. And you have Poison Dart, which can hit any position. Thrown Dagger is interesting. Thrown Dagger deals a little less damage, but it's basically full damage. It has a high crit chance. It gets bonus damage against Blight. It gets bonus damage against Marked. And it buffs your accuracy. The accuracy buff really doesn't matter. A lot of people think, well, I'll just waste a turn setting up the Blight. I don't really recommend that. There are situations where that's valuable, like in single target DPS situations, you lead Blight and then you lead Dagger because you get the bonus damage, and they're going to be, if you know the fight's going multiple rounds anyways, they'll be taking the Blight damage. The Blight damage has a good crit mod on it, and it deals about half your damage output. The Blight damage itself isn't very good. 3 points of Blight damage per turn. It does last 4 rounds, which is a relatively long time for Blight damage, by the way. Most Blight damage does not last that long. However, at the end of the day, it's mostly a chip away skill. This build is very much a chip away. You're either leading Dart, Poison Dart, followed by single daggers for damage, or you're going to lead flashing daggers, followed by either thrown or poison darts for finishing. So for example, if you go flashing daggers and the rest of your team kills the back row, then you're going to run poison dart on whoever's in the 1 position just because that's all you can do. And if there's still back row threats, then you'll run throwing daggers to help finish them off faster. If you're in a single target scenario, you're going to lead dart and then dagger until you need to refresh dart again. And pickaxe is kind of just there in case you need Ooga Booga swing from the 1 position. This is why Ooga Boogas are good. Overall, this class is very good at dealing damage. They're very combo based, and they don't deal high damage unless you're critting or you're setting up some of your factors, but overall they're a pretty solid class. One downside that they do have is they are quite squishy. They rely a lot on high speed and high dodge chance to get value. If you're not very dodgy and you're not very fast, you're going to die an awful lot because you'll take hits. And that is a big downside on the melee class. The melee version of the class really suffers because of how low their HP is, and they want to do a lot of dancing in and out like the Shield Breaker has. They really rely on the stealth from Shadow Fade to protect them. So then, the next class that we're going to talk about that is a combo class is going to be the Highwayman. The Highwayman is very similar in that they have 2 builds. They have a melee build and a range build. They rely a lot on high damage and crits, and dodge and speed, because they're relatively low health. So there are 2 main builds that we're going to cover. They share some similar tricks to them. Both of these, one thing that's good about this class in particular is that they can run both a range and a melee skill in any build, so no matter where you get shuffled to, you get some type of value. So for example, The range build, which my boy Dismas here has, he's running multiple range damage dealing skills. You have Grape Shot Blast, which hits the first 3 targets. This can only be used in the 2 or the 3. This is why I don't have him as a backup character. He actually works very well in the 2. He gets Pistol Shot, Grape Shot Blast, and Open Vein. So he has a melee, he has a group hit, a melee hit, and a ranged hit at the 2 position. If he gets moved up to the 1, he gets Point Blank Shot. If he gets moved back to the 3 or the 4, then he still has Grape Shot at the 3, or he'll just spam pistol shots at the 4. Similarly, the melee build works kind of similar. The melee build, while you're in the 1, you have Point Blank Shot plus Slice and Bleed. If you are in the 2, you've got Slice and Bleed, obviously, and you have Duelist Advance. If you're in the 3 or the 4, well, if you're in the 3, you've got Bleed. If you're in the 3 or the 4, you've got Duelist Advance to get up into position. So you always have options with this class. Now, if you notice, the one skill that I'm not talking about is Tracking Shot. Tracking Shot can be used anywhere, but you only get to use it once. And it hits the 2, 3, or 4, it removes their stealth. It gives you a buff, 12% damage, 6 AC, 4 crit. Not very good. The crit and the damage are nice, the AC is kind of worthless, but you only use it once. So the idea is to use it at the start of the fight against a stealth enemy, and if you don't have a stealth enemy, it's pretty much useless. I don't really like it. The loss of damage is not worth the D-stealth. I don't like D-stealth abilities. D-stealth is relatively uncommon, so that's... ignore it. So let's talk about the range skills first. Let's talk about the melee skills first. Wicked Slice is basically just Ooga Booga Swing. It's got a damage buff on it, and it's got a crit modifier on it, which is relatively significant. This thing hits pretty hard. Then you have Open Vein, which is an Ooga Booga Swing as well. Now this deals slightly less damage than your normal attacks, which means it deals about... it's dealing 30% less damage than your regular slices. But it is applying a bleed effect to the opponent, 3 points of damage for 3 turns, a bleed debuff, and -2 speed. Which, the -2 speed combined with the damage over time is the real reason why it's good. Sometimes it's more valuable in a longer fight. It's easier to lead Open Vein for the speed drop and the damage over time. If you think you're going to kill them in one shot, or if it's a slower fight, Wicked Slice is your better option. But you have 2 damage options. Point Blank Shot is very high damage, decent crit. It knocks you back 1, it knocks them back 1. You can play a really unique range build, which is what I do. Duelist Advance to move from the 2 to the 1, and then Point Blank Shot to move back from the 1 to the 2. This is a very good way to reset. If you are playing with a character that wants to be in the 1, that's relatively slow, like say a Leper, then you can use Duelist to move up to the 1, Point Blank to move back to the 2, and then you can stay in the 2 using Wicked or Open Vein. Point Blank Shot is basically a one-shot kill on most things in the game, and it's very good for that reason. The downside can sometimes be if you don't kill them, and they move back to the 2, that's very rarely an issue. The other option you have is the Duelist Advance. This gives you the riposte counter stance that the Man of Arms has. You deal less damage while you are in the riposte, but you get a little bit of a crit bonus. Basically, it's the same reason that he has, is that it gives you the ability to attack when you otherwise couldn't. The damage on it is not nearly as low as the Man of Arms, and it has a much stronger crit chance. So this, if you get a crit, it's basically just as good as a Wicked Slice. If you don't get a crit, it's basically just an Open Vein, but without the bleed and the slow. So generally you have a lot of options similar to the Man of Arm as to how you open. Do you open with Duelist Advance if you're in the 2, or do you go for the direct damage with Wicked Slice or Open Vein? If you're in the 1, you go Point Blank to move back to the 2. That way there on your next turn, you have the same gamble. Do I go for a kill with Slice or Bleed, or do I go for Duelist to move forward? The range version of the build plays anywhere from the 2 through the 4. Ideally, you want to be the 2 and the 3, so you have access to Grape Shot and Open Vein. You don't really want to sit in the 4. If you sit in the 4, your only option is Pistol Shot. Point Blank Shot is here just in case you get moved up to the 1. You can use Point Blank to go backwards. That's the main reason why it's here. I like Open Vein on this build as opposed to Tracking Shot, just because I really do like the bleed and the speed debuff on it. Occasionally there'll be times where I'm going up against an enemy that has a low bleed resist, so I'll use this on them, particularly if I'm in the 2 or the 3 and they're in the 1 or the 2, where if they're in the 1 and I can't use Pistol Shot on them, I don't want to use Grape Shot on them, and I'm not in the 1 for Point Blank, Open Vein is good for hitting that 1 target for reliable damage. The bleed and the slow is better than using Wicked Slice for the crit, in my opinion, but you do you if you like that choice. Pistol Shot deals slightly less damage than normal, but it has a high crit modifier, and it also deals 40% damage against marked. You don't have any way to mark targets, so you need somebody else to set that up, but it's not really worth playing with a marked target user. The main reason you run this is just it's reliable chip shot damage for the 3 and the 4. And the 2 if you need to. Grape Shot is your skill that you're using for burst damage. It's very inaccurate. It's 90%. You're not getting a lot of accuracy with this. What it does is it does debuff your targets. There's a bonus that they crit. They take more crits, I should say. It deals half your damage, and it has a low crit chance on it. However, it's reliable. I shouldn't say it's reliable, but it's reliable damage output against multiple enemies, and the fact that it increases their chance of receiving crits can very much help soften them up. This is pretty much something that you'll lead a fight with. You can lead the fight with Grape Shot to get some chip damage in on everybody, and kind of just never use it again. There's no real point to using this after the opening turn, so you kind of just lead this unless you specifically need a kill with Pistol Shot. That's how I use it. But it's a nice option to have. Overall, this is a class that benefits a lot from speed and crits. No matter what your build is, whether you're melee or range, you're going to be using speed and crits a lot. So for the specific range damage dealers, we have 3 options. That would be the Musketeer and the Arbalist, which function pretty much exactly the same. And then we have the Houndmaster. The Houndmaster is an interesting character. They're not really a designated backline character. They kind of just play there. So looking at their skills, they're interesting because they have a lot of support. So the basic 2 skills that everyone's going to run are both basically backline options. You have the Hound's Rush, which is a 2 through 4 skill. This is why you're primarily going to sit in the back. It doesn't deal a lot of damage, but what it does do is it does bonus damage to Beast, bonus damage to Mark, and it deals a little bit of bleed. The bleed's not good. Don't rely on the bleed for kills. But it's just a nice bonus to help make up for the lack of damage a little bit. The overall lower damage output is a bit annoying, but it is what it is. The other option that you have is your group damage option, similar to Grape Shot. This applies bleed and damage to everybody at the cost of much lower damage. This is 1 to 3 damage max, and it doesn't crit a lot, but it has a high potential for bleeding. So it's useful for at the start of a fight with multiple enemies. If you don't need to kill a particular target immediately with Hound's Rush, you can use this. One of the things that this class overall suffers with is a lack of damage. They don't do a lot of damage. But that's where the rest of their kit comes in for support. Now, if you're in the 1 position, you're kind of screwed. The only option you really have is Harry's Hound. You get access to Blackjack, which deals little damage, but is a guaranteed stun. So if you're stuck in the 1 or the 2, you can smack him, stun him, and hopefully somebody else moves forward into your spot, or you move backwards into your normal spot. This is not a mandatory skill. I run it just because you kind of want to have something to do if you get shuffled into the 1. The rest of your skills are either self or team buffs. So, first off, you have the target whistle, and I just don't like this skill. It doesn't deal any damage, it marks the target. The idea is similar to the Bounty Hunter, where you set up the bonus damage for Hound Rush. The problem that you have with doing that is that it's not providing any other utility. Whereas Mark Target on the Bounty Hunter gives you a speed bonus and the protection debuff, this is just giving you the protection debuff. It's kind of a wasted turn. You're better off just attacking twice with Hound Rush and maybe hoping for a crit, which does just about the same thing. That's the main reason I don't run it. Yeah, it can be used in any position, but it's not actively helping you if you use it when you're in the 1 or the 2. So then for your utility skills, if you're in the back, you get access to Cry Havoc. This is a chance to reduce stress for your entire team. It's not a high stress removal, there is a chance it doesn't work, and it's based on each individual character, but this can be a good turn skipper. You can use this to kind of just burn the stress. You can burn a turn by stress relieving. It's good for that. It's not as clutch of a stress as the Crusader stress relief is, but it's a nice option to have. It's good to just have some form of stress relief. Some people would argue that it's because it has a chance to miss, and it's not enough stress healing, it's not worth it. I still have it on 1. Then you have Lick Wounds. This is another turn waster, really. It heals yourself for a small amount of HP. Houndmasters have low health to begin with, so you can, this can get about a quarter of your HP. So it's not that bad of a heal. The fact that it can help you reduce the healing that your healer needs to do. But again, this is kind of a turn waste style ability, where if you know they're going to die to Blight or Bleed, and you just want to sit in the back and recover a little bit, rather than, killing them outright, you can use this. The other one is Guard Dog. Guard Dog is interesting. It functions similar to the guard ability for the Man of War, but instead of guarding an ally and giving yourself damage reduction, you are guarding the ally and giving yourself a better dodge chance. Now, I don't think this is as effective as the Man of Arms guard, because the damage reduction is more reliable. Enemies can still hit you through a high dodge chance, and they can debuff your dodge. So it's not the best strategy in the world. However, the difference is that the Houndmaster has less useful options. Like, the best option here is Hound Rush for damage, whereas Guard Dog can be very helpful for single turn, take some heat off a healer or a low health frontline. And the Man of War has a lot of good skills. They have a lot of things going for them, where guarding an ally can be pushed down the list, versus they have a higher damage melee option, they have Riposte they can activate, they have Bellow they can activate, so they have more tools that are sitting in front, they have more options in front, so the Houndmaster can get away with slaughters. This is one of the weaker of the range classes in the game. In my opinion, it's actually the weakest of the designated range classes. But it's not useless. And also, who doesn't like having a doggy on their team? It also provides very good camping skills. You can run him just for preventing nighttime ambush during camping. Next up, we have the Musketeer and the Arbalist, and these characters function almost exactly the same. They almost always want to be in the 3 or the 4, doesn't matter what position they're in, and they have next to no options for dealing with targets that are in the 1 and the 2, or if they're in the 1 or the 2. So, here's the basics on what they do. You're going to see how exactly similar they are. Sniper shot is a basic damage shot. It doesn't have any bonus modifier on it. It has a higher chance of critting. The main thing is that it deals bonus damage to mark and bonus crit chance against marked targets. Now you do have a way to mark a target, which is Sniper's Mark. The problem is that it requires a turn of setup, and this class pretty much just wants to sit in the back and snipe. It's better if a teammate applies the mark than you yourself, but because of how absurdly high the damage gets, you can run a Sniper's Mark sniper build. I personally prefer some of the other options. Suppressing fire is terrible. It hits the back 2 targets for next to no damage. It has the low crit chance, low damage chance, and it just debuffs them. It reduces their accuracy and crit chance. It's not worth running. You're better off killing a target with Sniper Shot than you are debuffing them. There is also Rallying Flare. This does no damage, affects the entire enemy team. It brightens the torch, it clears all D-stealth, and for your team, it removes stuns, marks, and a little bit of stress. This is a niche option. I would run this if I ran any of these skills. I don't run it because all it does is D-stealth and clear stun. That's all you're going to use this for. Most of the time, if an enemy is stealth, it's going to be one enemy that's stealth, and it's going to be a backline character. Which, in that situation, you're better off hitting Suppressing Fire that hits both of them. 4 damage. And if it's for the stun clear really isn't that great. The stun clear is something that you would run if you're running up against a group that is an enemy team that has, like, the jellyfish. Like, if it's 3 or 4 jellyfish and they're just stunning your whole team, that's fine. But if they're stunning your whole team, they're going to target you a lot of the time and stun you. And you don't have good stun resist. The main skills that I run Bolo and Blind Fire just because these 2 skills are like the only ways you can hit the 1 position. That's the biggest problem. Sniper Shot is reliable enough damage for hitting the 2 through 4. You don't have to worry about that. But if you need to hit the 1, your only option is Bolo and Blind Fire. Blind Fire is here because if you're in the 1 or the 2, this is the only option you have. It hits a random target, but if there's only 1 enemy, it's going to hit that target. It gives you a speed boost, and it can be used in the 1. That's kind of why it's here. It's kind of your obligatory, if I get thrown out of position, I have something to do move. The Bolo's a bit better. It hits both the 1 and the 2, which can make it useful. It deals half your normal damage, and it knocks them back 1 space. That's not really the value. The main value is that it hits the 1 and the 2, so it can be useful if you are able to pick off the back row early on for, say, a 1-shot, and it's just somebody up the front. Blind Fire is best if there's somebody in the 1 only. And Bolo is better if there's somebody in the 1-2 spots. And then you have Battlefield Bandage. This is a solid heal. It's on par with the Crusader heal, but it also gives the target that you're healing bonus healing for the next time. So if you use this 2 turns in a row, your first heal is going to be about 3 to 4, your second heal is going to be about 4 to 5, but if a designated healer is healing them, that can be more significant. So if you're giving them, say, let's say a 4 heal plus the bonus, but you have a Vestal that gives them a 10 heal, that 10 heal now becomes a 13 or a 14 heal. Overall, it's a long-range sniper class. Pretty much all you need to say. And kind of similarly is the Musketeer. The Musketeer is a long-range 3-4 class that hits the opposing team's 3-4 and plays nearly exactly the same. Aim Shot, which is a high-damage sniper ability that has high crit chance. It deals bonus damage and bonus crit to marked targets. What else does it get? It gets the ability to mark a target that deals no damage and does dodge. It's the exact same thing that the Arbalest has. You have the Smoke Screen, which is, again, a double hit for the 3-4 position on the enemy team. It deals no damage. Well, next to no damage, and it reduces their accuracy and crit. literally the same two moves, and they are both useless like before. You get Skeet Shot, which is again a multi-hit ability that deals no damage, removes stealth, buffs the torch, clears, yada yada. Same as before. They literally have the exact same skills. They're just two different versions. Where they differentiate is their camping skills, and that the Musketeer is slightly faster than the Arbalist is. But these two classes are basically your dedicated, I sit in the back and I snipe backline targets type class. So, what does that leave? Well, that leaves the designated healers. There are two of them, and the Plague Doctor. I'm going to cover the Plague Doctor first. The Plague Doctor is kind of interesting in that they're a support character, but they're not a healing support character. They're a debuff and buff character. There's two basic builds. One is complete support debuff, and one is more offensive based. So the more offensive based wants to play from the 3, where they get access to their 3 best damage options, which are pretty much their only 3 damage options. That's Incision, Grenade, and Noxious. Noxious only hits the 1-2 and provides significant blight damage. 6 blight for 3 rounds. And reduces their accuracy. It doesn't deal a lot of damage up front, but that blight damage over time is what eats away at them. It makes them the premium blight dealer in the game. If you're going to Ruins, you definitely want to run them. The Plague Grenade is slightly lesser, but the Plague Grenade hits the 3-4 position of the enemy team. Again, higher blight, 5 blight per turn, a little less, but still really good. And it hits both targets at once. So in the more offensive focus, you basically prioritize your blight on whoever's more menacing. If the back line's more menacing, you go for Grenade. If the front line's more menacing, you go Noxious. And this effect can keep stacking. There is no way on either of these skills, however, to have a blight debuff. So sometimes pairing them with an Abomination in the 2 is good for the Bile. That way there you can just combo blight everything to death. You also have Incision. Now, Incision can be used at the 1-2-3, which is important. It's one of the only skills you have that can be used if you're stuck in the 1-2 position. But what it does is, it's just, I swing for damage, high crit chance, and applies a little bit of bleed. It makes it useful in situations where you have enemies that are susceptible to both blight and bleed. For your gimmicky options, this is where we go to this guy. You get a lot of options here. For helping your team, you have 2, and for debuffing the enemy, you get 2. For the debuff, you have Blinding Gas. This is very good. It deals no damage, but it's a stun against the back row. So usually a back row Plague Doctor is deciding between, do I stun or do I blight the back row at the start? And then they need to use either Noxious or Incision against frontline targets when the back row is dealt with. Overall, it's okay to have, but if that's your only way of dealing with back row, you're not really going to get a lot of value. So you need to pair Blinding Gas with Plague Grenade, so you have a back row option for actually damaging them. And that kind of limits your utility to being a back row character. Less flexible in the 2 or the 3 position. The other option you have is Disorienting Blast. Now this is a stun that you can use at the 2, and it can also hit the 2. It clears corpses, which, meh. It's a flashbang basically. No damage, but it stuns and shuffles the order a little bit. Not really usable. I find that the Plague Grenade is better, or the Stun Grenade is better because it stuns 2 as opposed to 1. It's also much more accurate than Disorienting Blast is. So, that's the main reason why I run that over. For buffing your team, you have 2 options. Battlefield Medicine is a very small heal that cures blight and bleed. It's just a nice filler thing to have. You never know when the blight or bleed is going to be handy, and it can be useful in downtime turns, not when you're stalling for time at the end, but let's say you have everybody is blighted, everybody is stunned, or everybody is bleeding, Instead of stacking an extra on them, you can use Battlefield Medicine to just get an extra healing. And if you're somebody like this guy right here who has a healing quirk on them, then that healing can be a little bit better at higher levels. The other option is Emboldening Vapors. This really lets you buff your team, and this is really where you have to choose at the start of the fight what you're going to do. This lets you buff a teammate, you can't buff yourself, for plus speed, plus damage. This makes frontline characters like Hellions and Lepers much more threatening. And if they're already a high damage, high crit, like a bounty hunter, this makes them very dangerous. This is essentially sacrificing your turn to make a teammate much more lethal. You can stack it on the same target twice to get a really super tanky type damage build going, but I don't really recommend that. If this character is built like this and they're playing primarily from the 4, and you have a designated healer in the 3, and your frontline characters are more melee focused, you can pop an Emboldening Vapors in back-to-back turns on both of them and let them be very dangerous. For example, a Shield Breaker and a Man of Arms, you can offset the lower damage that their skills deal by giving them Emboldening Vapor plus giving them an added speed edge. Overall, this class is very buff and debuff based. Alright, last up we have the 2 primary healers. The dedicated healer will cover last because she's pretty easy. The more complicated healer is the Occultist. The Occultist is here as a healer because they have the highest base heal in the game without relying on percentage, which is word reconstruction. The way this works is, you just do massive chunk heal. Massive. But it's a range. So, you can roll a low heal of a 0, a 1, a 2, a 3, and get hit for bleed. Or, you can heal for 15 to 20 healing. He's very much a burst healer, and he's kind of a spam healer at that. You can't wait till a target gets too low, because if they get, if they roll a 0 through 4 heal, they're kind of worthless at that point. That heal was basically for nothing. And it can bleed you. It can do some bleed damage as well. Now, having a high bleed resist is nice because it keeps, your target can skip the bleeding. But at the same time, you have to run the risk that, okay, I'm just not doing enough healing here. The rest of their tricks are kind of gimmicky. They're definitely helpful if you know how to use them. But at first glance, this class seems very hit or miss. They're playing primarily from the 3 if you run Sacrificial Stab, and if you don't, you put them in the 4. Sacrificial Stab is kind of their de facto frontline option as well if they're in the 1 or the 2, and it's also good for hitting the opposing team 1 or 2. It does have a chance to miss no matter what. It's never going to be perfectly accurate, but it does have a high crit mod, and it can deal significant damage off of that. It's sometimes unreliable. It's better to just focus on healing and backline, but if need be, it's a good option. If you don't have that option, your next best bet is Hands from Abyss. I really don't like Hands from Abyss. It's a stun that you use in the front that reduces torch and doesn't deal a lot of damage. I just prefer the raw damage output that Sacrificial Stab has if you are in the 1-2, so that's the reason why I don't run it. For backline, you have 2 great options that you're going to run most of the time. Artillery and Pull. So, Artillery deals slightly less damage than your base, but it hits both the 3-4 at the same time. It's an okay crit bonus, and it deals bonus to Eldritch, although that is a relatively uncommon enemy type. The real heavy hitter is Pull. Now, Pull deals 50% less damage to 1 target. However, it clears all corpses, pulls the target forward, and has a high crit mod. This is a good skill for just getting a kill on a low health target. If there's a guy sitting in the back with 4 health or lower, and they are in the back, you can just use this to kill them most of the time. Most of the time, you're gonna deal about 3 to 4 damage to them with this skill. It's also good for just clearing corpses too at that. So it's a nice skill for both of those uses. I actually don't use it for the pull on it that often, believe it or not. Most of the time you're going to sit in the back and be using your healing, but the start of the fight is always best to either use artillery for damage to backline or pull for damage to backline. If there's only one target up the front, that's where your curses come in. You can get weakening curse or you can get vulnerability. Vulnerability is kind of weak. It deals like 1 or 2 damage. It reduces their dodge a bit and it marks them. Primarily, this is what you're going to run if you're playing with, say, a mark-heavy team. I personally just don't like it. Weakening Curse is much better. Weakening Curse deals more damage by default. You can deal in the 2 to 4 damage on damage, which makes it reliable. It does have a decent crit on it. The main draw is 17% damage reduction. You can debuff whoever you hit for decent damage. So it's pretty good against frontline characters on the opposing side that tend to hit relatively hard. You can take a couple of points off their damage, which takes some of the strain off of you as a healer. So that's the main reason. Because it can be used in the 1 or the 2, most of these builds are relatively the same. Although you can make a build that uses the vulnerability hex to mark targets. The Occultist does have a relatively high speed and high dodge, so they're very good for this. The main benefit you would play them for is the healing, though, and the downside is they really require you to heal them a lot. The last class that we have to cover before I end the video, thank God, is the Vestal. The Vestal is a class that is a primarily dedicated healer. They have other options that they need to use, but every Vestal is going to run the same 3 skills. Single target heal, group heal. Not much really to say. The group heal can be used at the 2 as well. So if you're in the 1, you're borderline useless. If you're in the 2, you get the party heal, which isn't that great, but it can be useful in situations where everybody's taking a lot of chip damage. For example, if you've taken blanket fire from a musketeer, it can be helpful for healing back some of that damage consistently. Or if you have 2 characters that you need to heal at once, you can use the party heal in back-to-back turns and get them both healed up around the same, if you're trying to keep your team at a certain spot. Whereas Divine, the single target heal, is a much stronger single target DPS heal, but can only be used while you're in the 3 or the 4. So if you're stuck in the 1 or the 2 for whatever reason, your priority is either to move back or to pop heal. This class is really based around healing. If your team doesn't take a lot of damage, that's when you can use your other options. Unfortunately, the other options aren't very good. If you're in the 1, your best option is Mace Bash. It's low damage, and it just smacks a target that's in the 1 or the 2, but it's got bonus damage against Unholy. If you're also in the 1 or the 2, you get access to Range of Light, which deals low damage, but gets a bonus to Unholy damage, and it gives you a damage buff. I don't recommend this build. While it does make you more combat-oriented, and it allows you to be more useful in combat, your best bet with your 2 healing skills is to kind of just sit in the back and heal and do some range damage as support, rather than trying to get up and brawl. You could also have access to Illumination, which does like no damage and removes stealth. It's a decent option, but you have to be in the 1 through 3 to use it. It can hit just about anybody. It's actually one of the better de-stealth abilities in the game, because this class really isn't using their 4th skill, so you can throw this on and be helpful. I have a class that has it. Dazzling Light is your designated stun. It's a pretty good stun. It has a decent crit. It deals low damage, but it's used in the back row and is helpful for stunning frontline targets, primarily. Your primary method of attack, though, is going to be Judgment. Judgment is a ranged attack that you use in the 3-4. It only deals 75% of your base damage, although it does have a decent crit mod. The main value is you heal yourself for a certain amount of HP every time you hit it. This is the main reason why this class doesn't really need to focus on healing themselves. You can kind of just use Judgment and hit backline targets early in a fight, So if you don't run the stun, where I would lead with stun, if you run judgment, you can kind of use judgment and zap backline targets. Then when your team starts to take damage, you can go into a healing roll, and if they're healed to full and you're looking for something to do, you can go back to judgment for damage or a stun. The class is very flexible, but it's also very frail. It does next to nothing up front, and it pretty much relies on just straight healing. While you don't want to focus on just spam healing every single turn, there will be times where you need to spam heal. And the problem is a lot of your trinkets also need to focus around healing as well. So that covers the majority of the classes for the game, and that covers how you want to play them in build.